So we are talking about the Beinoni and how this chapter tells us that the Beinoni is within reach. Every single one of us could become a Beinoni if we choose to be so. We're on page 62 if you're looking inside the book. That's page numbers at the bottom of the page. And this evening what we want to focus on is that we've made it abundantly clear, that we are not going to be a tzaddik. And I know some people are taking this very hard and having all kinds of withdrawal symptoms and whatever other mental health meltdowns over the fact that we're not going to become a tzaddik. However, what we are going to learn tonight, and this is something we thought we were going to do already a couple of weeks ago, and we didn't end up doing it, is to see whether or not that means that we could at least sometimes have a tzaddik experience. Because remember that before a person is born, the Gemara told us that they make your soul take an oath that you will be a tzaddik. And then there was the caveat, and you will not be a rasha. And that's part of what we've been analyzing over here. Why do you have both sides of the deal? If you're telling me that I need to aspire to become a tzaddik, it's kind of self-evident then that I'm not going to become a rasha, because a tzaddik is a very high level of person, and a rasha is somebody who's not aligned with what they should be doing spiritually. So why do I have to have both sides of that particular covenant? And we've been trying to unpack and contextualize and understand this principle. But what we haven't yet done, and we're going to have to pay that attention this evening, is you can't escape the fact that it says Tehi Tzadik, that the opening line was, commit yourself to be a tzaddik. So that implies that it is still part of what we're supposed to focus on. Even though we've made it so clear that we're never going to get there and it's completely beyond our reach, and a tzaddik is not simply a person who does the right things, but a tzaddik has so much self-mastery that they ensure that they never feel the wrong feelings that could even lead to, or think the wrong thoughts that could even lead to a person entertaining all kinds of negative things. So if the tzaddik is so advanced and the tzaddik is such a lofty level, and it's very clear to us that a tzaddik is beyond our scope, why was it ever part of the conversation? Tehi tzaddik, that you will be a tzaddik. Okay, so that's part of the conversation that we have to try to unpack this evening. So if you are looking at the Tanya book, page 62, then it's going to be just before. Do you see that there's two full stops over there? So there's actually three. So there's actually four. So just before the first of them, that's where we're going to take a look. So actually, let's do this. Let's make it easier. Let's go back to the third line after the new paragraph on page 62, which means if you're looking on the screen, it's actually the first line that is now on the screen. The first word on this line is the word rasha, and then there's a full stop, and we're gonna start from there. Okay? So at this point, we're analyzing the double-edged undertaking that a soul makes before we're born. And that undertaking is Tehi Tzadik, that we commit ourselves that we will actually be a Tzadik. And in addition to that, Al Tehi Rasha, that we will not be a wicked person as well. So why do we have the double-edged undertaking? That's what we're going to unpack over here. Ella. Mishum she'ein kol adam zoiche liyos tzaddik, because the reality is that not every person will attain that merit of becoming a tzaddik. And we've already analyzed this. We analyzed the fact that we're using the word adam over here, which means a person who's quite spiritually advanced. And in spite of the fact that they're spiritually advanced, we're still saying that they're not necessarily going to make it to become a tzaddik. And the other thing that we analyzed over here is the word zoiche, that it's like a merit, meaning to say almost as if you need Hashem's help in order to become a tzaddik. It's not purely in our hands. And that's the next line that he says, because at the end of the day, while we do have free choice, and free choice is a foundational principle of Judaism, and the Rambam, for example, tells us that if we do not believe in free choice, then the whole of Judaism is unfair. You can't reward people for things they didn't choose to do, and you cannot lay consequences on people for things that they didn't choose to do. So obviously, choice is a very fundamental principle within Judaism, and yet there are limits of choice. So, for example, you remember we used the example of the guy who wants to jump off the roof. So we're going to tell him it's not a good idea. And we're going to do everything in our power to dissuade him from jumping off the roof. But at the end of the day, it is his choice. And if he makes a poor choice and he decides to jump off the roof, he's going to hurt himself. But if a guy's standing on the ground level and he wants to jump onto the roof, we don't have to get involved because that's no longer his choice. It's not physically possible. The person just doesn't have the physical capacity to jump from the ground onto the roof. So in the same way, if a person, for example, decides that they're going to choose to do something which is good, okay, you can choose to do something which is good. And equally, and therefore, because the person has chosen to do something which is good, we can say that they deserve some kind of reward for it because they made a healthy choice. And equally, if a person chooses to do something bad, well, then they have to own that choice because at the end of the day, they made the choice and it was very much in their jurisdiction. And so therefore, they have to face the consequences of the choice that they've made. However, if there's something that is not a matter of our choice, well, then we can't be held accountable for not doing it. And obviously, we're not going to be rewarded for doing it because we're not going to do it. So that's what we say over here. When it comes to being a tzaddik, that is not something which is purely a matter of our free choice. It's not. You have to have certain abilities. You have to have certain potential in order to become a tzaddik. And the reason for that is because the tzaddik, as we've already discussed multiple times, is not just somebody who's doing the right thing and avoiding the wrong thing, but rather, lehisaneg al Hashem be'emes. The definition of a tzaddik is that this is somebody whose pleasure in life is directly associated with Hashem. So that's very different to us. The pleasures that we have in life are very often associated with physical things. What do you enjoy? I don't know. Some people enjoy sport. Some people enjoy good food. Some people enjoy excursions, going to luxury getaways or whatever the case is. Now, if a person derives their pleasure in life from any one of those things, then that automatically indicates that it is not Hashem that gives them their pleasure in life. Because those are the choices. It's either the one or the other. Either what we care about is good food and brand label clothing and fancy resorts, or we care about Hashem. Now, that's not necessarily something which is so open to our choice. You don't necessarily choose what it is that you enjoy, right? So, for example, when you're growing up as a kid, and your mother tells you that you have to eat your Brussels sprouts, you might eat them. Okay, luckily if you live in Joburg, you're off the hook because Brussels sprouts are infested with insects and they're not considered kosher, so you're off the hook. But if you're eating your Brussels sprouts, that's just conforming. It doesn't necessarily mean that you actually enjoy them, and nobody can tell you to enjoy it. Just because you're doing something which is healthy, or just because you're doing something which is right, doesn't necessarily mean that it's an enjoyable experience. So that's what we're saying over here, that you don't have mishpat abachira, you don't really have the concept of free choice in terms of what you're going to land up enjoying in life. So seeing as the role of the tzaddik is somebody who absolutely loves doing what Hashem wants, and that's what gives them their pleasure in life, well then that means that the tzaddik is not something which is in the purview of the average person. And likewise, v'shiyora ma'us mamish be'emes, the other side of the coin, which is that the tzaddik is disgusted by things which are misaligned with what Hashem wants. And we've spent a lot of time speaking about this, how there are things that the Torah tells us that we're not allowed to do, and maybe we're very disciplined around those things, and we make sure that we don't do them, and we're not breaking any rules, but that doesn't mean that we're disgusted by those things, right? Could you imagine the case? Just picture this for a scene, okay? So we know, for example, the Torah tells us, we say it in the Shema every single day, that you're not supposed to veer after your eyes and after your heart. And what that means is that those are two mitzvahs. The one mitzvah is that we're not supposed to entertain thoughts of idolatry. That's what it means to veer after your heart. And the other one is quite literal, that we're not supposed to look at things that we're not supposed to look at. There's certain things that are very attractive. That's the challenge of life. And we're not supposed to look at them. So what would happen if an individual had to say, listen here, I'm a very frum person. And because I'm such a very frum person, I don't have a problem going to the beach because I don't notice anything or anyone who's running around over there clad as they might be clad. We're going to say, sorry for you, but you don't actually have the choice on this. That's, it's the way that Hashem has designed human beings, is that people notice certain things and they are therefore attracted to those things. And that's why the Torah has to mandate that I'm not supposed to look, because it's natural for a person to be attracted to these things. Now, if I was a tzaddik, that would be a whole different story. The tzaddik literally would not find it attractive at all. In fact, to the contrary, it'd actually find it to be something which is quite sickening to him, to see people running around like that. But for the rest of us who are not tzaddikim, we shouldn't pretend, and we certainly should not expose ourselves to things that are not so healthy for us, because we're trying to propose that we're some kind of a tzaddik. So that's what we're talking about over here, where we say that the first part of the promise that we're made, that we make before we're born, which is that we're going to be a tzaddik. It's very aspirational, but at the same time, if we're doing a reality check, we recognize that we're not going to be those people, and we're not necessarily going to have, all of that self-focus and control and lack of desire, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Therefore, we have the second part of the oath. Therefore, you have the second part of the oath, which is basically to say, Al tehirash al kol panim, that even if you can't reach the point of being a tzaddik, and you can't reach the point where you have such self-control that what really makes you tick is your experiences related to Hashem, and what really makes you feel uncomfortable and upset and sickened or whatever is anything which is misaligned with Hashem. So if you can't get there, at the very least, don't be a Rasha. At the very least, don't do bad things. Right? So let's just say, for argument's sake, let's use a really extreme example just to illustrate this point. Let's say that a person battles with sticky fingers. Right? That's what they battle with. And I know that when you hear that, you immediately think, oh my gosh, what's wrong with that person? How can you walk into a shop and just shoplift? But the reality is, the reality is that there are a lot of people out there who unfortunately are tempted to do a little bit of white collar crime. If you have a look, unfortunately, the Jewish community has its fair amount of white collar criminals. And very often when people do those things, it's because they feel tempted to, they see a lot of money. Let's say a person is helping managing somebody else's money, so they see a lot of transfer of money, and they start to feel a little envious, and they'd like to have a piece of the pie, and they justify to themselves that nobody's going to miss it. That's very often the case, right? And nobody's going to even notice that this amount of money went missing. So you have those stories of people who took, 0.01% of every bank account or something like that, so nobody knows, nobody feels the difference. In the meantime, I'm enriching myself. So we're not going to suggest that person will have such a major shift in terms of their sentiment that they're actually going to be sickened by that temptation. But that doesn't excuse the behavior. So we're going to tell this person, okay, listen, you don't have to be a tzaddik. You don't have to be somebody who gets queasy every single time there's the possibility of stealing money. You don't have to be that person. You can actually accept your natural tendency to be tempted to steal, but just don't steal. Just don't be a Rasha. So that's really what the oath is all about up here, which is basically saying, okay, ideally you should be a tzaddik. Ideally you should be the kind of person, that's what you should wish for, and that's what you should aspire towards. That's what you should constantly be working on to be that person who really loves things which are associated with godliness and so on and so forth. And you shouldn't be that person who's engaged in bad things. But practically, until you've sorted out your stuff and until you've reached this high level of very deep energy and enthusiasm and excitement about godliness, at the very least, just don't break any laws. And don't excuse the fact that you're breaking laws on the fact that, well, I'm not a tzaddik yet. That's nonsense. Okay, so that's basically what we've learned so far. And what we say, the capacity to not be a Rasha, that is something that every one of us is empowered to be able to do. Every one of us has enough choice that we could choose not to do bad things, and then we could choose to do appropriate things. So for example, let's just say that I'm supposed to give tzedakah. So maybe I don't feel like giving tzedakah. Maybe I hate giving tzedakah. Maybe every single time that I have to part with some of my money, it really makes me feel very painful. Like my stomach churns every time that I have to give money away. At the end of the day, don't be a Rasha. If you're expected to give tzedakah, give tzedakah. I'm sure you've heard that story of the guy who had a very strange and rare illness, and the doctors determined that the only way that he would ever heal is he had to break a sweat, and that would allow all the toxins out. But the problem was that the nature of this illness was that it wasn't possible to sweat. So they called the rabbi. Obviously now this person's not doing very well and he's teetering on the edge. So obviously they called the rabbi, and the rabbi's job is to daven for him and to give him a bracha and whatever. So the rabbi says to him, the Gemara tells us that if a person gives tzedakah saves a person from death. So you've got to give tzedakah. That's basically the way that you're going to heal. So he says, okay, Rabbi, tell me, how much should I give? So he says, well, I don't know, you propose, and I'll tell you if I think it's sufficient, considering how severe the situation is. So the guy names a number. The rabbi says, no, I think you've got to increase. I mean, that's a joke. You're talking about a life and death issue over here. You've got to give a little bit more money. So the guy says, okay, fine, increases it by a percentage. So the rabbi says, no. I mean, you're talking about your life over here. We're not talking about, some kind of sidebar issue. This is your life. And he says, you've got to increase the amount. So the guy increases the amount. The rabbi says, no, still not good enough. You've got to increase it more. And this keeps going, Each time he makes a proposal, the rabbi says, you've got to give more money and more money. Eventually the guy says, okay, Rabbi, I'm sweating. So at the end of the day, sometimes you've got to be able to sweat to do what Hashem wants. And that's what it means not to be a Rasha. And we have the capacity to make that choice. Every single human being is capable of making a choice, either not to do something which they should not do, or to do something which is expected of them, even if they're not having all the sentiment that goes with it. So that's really the second part of this oath, where we say, Va'al tihi Rasha, don't be a Rasha, because that's completely within our purview. It's completely within our abilities. So how do you get there? Because every single person is empowered to have self-control. And that was the Hayom Yom today, by the way, about the mind controlling the heart. That at the end of the day, the way Hashem has designed human beings is that we all have the ability for self-control. So if somebody says, look, I don't feel passionate about my Judaism, we can say, okay, that's fair. We understand that. We accept that. Not everybody is automatically passionate for their Judaism. But the moment a person says, I can't control myself, this is just me, unfortunately. It's the way that I was wired. And therefore you have to accept me for who I am, because I have this particular vice and there's no way that I could get around it. We immediately protest that and we say, no, that's nonsense. The whole purpose of being a human is to have the ability to take control over impulses, take control over bad behavior, etc. And therefore there is no person on earth who can say, I have an excuse for being a Rasha. The guy comes to the rabbi and says, I have a note from my other rabbi. He said that I could be a Rasha. It's okay, it's acceptable, because he knows my circumstances and he knows where I come from. We're going to reject that out of hand. We're going to say there is no such thing. There's no person who's excused that they should be a Rasha. And that's why the second half of the oath, which is applicable to every person, is Ve'al tihi Rasha. Do everything in your power to ensure that you are not a Rasha, that you're not a bad person. Okay? And the reason for that is because V'lichvoish Yitzroi. Because every person is capable of conquering their Yetzer Hara. That means to say we acknowledge that every single person has impulses. That's how it is. To be a human being means that you have impulses. And to be a human being means that you are not the victim of those impulses. And that's probably one of the most empowering things that we could learn in life. We are not the victims of our impulses. Maybe there are other schools of thought that consistently bang on about that and say, well, this is just unfortunate. It's who you are. It's nature. It's nurture. It's your background. It's your environment. It's circumstances that are outside of your control, and are constantly excusing the poor choices that people make. Judaism says, forget about it. We don't come from that perspective. We come from the perspective that every single person fundamentally has the capacity, lichvoish yitzroi, to conquer, and it's a strong word, to conquer our impulsive side. So conquer implies that it requires a certain amount of strength. It requires that there's some degree of battle, but there's a guarantee. There's a guarantee that if we put our minds to it, we can actually have this self-control. And that's critically important for a person to know. And therefore, as a result of that, every single person is capable of reaching a point that they will never enter the realm of Rasha in their entire lives. And we're not talking over here about some superheroes. We're talking about us, regular people like us, who are holding down regular day jobs, who have regular distractions and temptations and weaknesses, all of that, and still it is possible for a person to be absolutely immune to being a Rasha their whole life. And we have to drum that into our heads. We have to keep reminding ourselves again and again and again and again that it's not good enough just to accept our weaknesses, and it's not good enough just to excuse our choices. We really need to be clear about the fact that we are empowered humans. And empowered humans means that we can make choices, even when they're hard choices. Even in the passion of the moment, we can make choices. It's an incredibly important thing for a person to remind themselves about all of the time. And he says that applies bein bivechinas sur meira, bein bivechinas va'asei tov. That once we acknowledge that we have this power, once we acknowledge that we are able to take control, then we need to know that we can take control both in the negative and in the positive. And it's really important to know that, because if you think about it, we're challenged on a daily basis in both of those areas. Every single day, things come up that tempt us to do what we should not do. And every single day, there are things that we're supposed to do that we're not necessarily motivated enough to do. And I don't think we have to necessarily get into detail about this, right? Because everybody can relate to this. Now, some people are better at avoidance, and some people are better at motivation. So that means that some people, if they know that something is forbidden by the Torah, then they'll put in a lot of effort to make sure that they never do those things. Because some people are conformist, and they really don't want to land up in an unhealthy place. So they'll invest a tremendous amount of energy to protect themselves from being in those unhealthy places. And other people, their superpower is the ability to be able to do things that are not easy to do. And if you think about it, you have a look around. Firstly, you can identify that within yourself, and you can identify that within other people as well. You can see that there's certain people, that's just how they are. You know, they're not necessarily the get up and go kind of people, but they are very cautious and very disciplined in terms of making sure that they don't do anything which is like really bad. And then there are other people who may be a little bit more loose and a little bit more flippant about things that are bad, but they are very motivated to do the proactive things that you're supposed to do. So, for example, and by the way, that's where people get all nose out of joint, and they think that people are being hypocritical because, for example, how could it be that you're at shul every single morning? So that's the person who's doing the proactive things, but you behave in this way, which is the person who doesn't have that self-control. And we get a little bit frustrated and maybe even annoyed at them, and we say, like, it doesn't add up. Which one are you? Are you committed or you're not committed? Are you in or are you out? And the reality is it's not that simple. The reality is that different people have different strengths, and different people tend to succeed in different areas. And we need to be able to identify, firstly, within ourselves, and secondly, within other people, where those strengths lie. What he's telling us over here is that that's only when we're looking at other people. So if you're frustrated with somebody else and you say, well, what kind of a hypocrite are you? Because you claim that you're so frum. Have you ever heard people speak like this? You claim that you're so frum, and you say that you're so whatever, and you always, you're the guy who's making a big fuss about coming to shul or going to the shir or whatever, yet, ... there's X in your life that you're not fulfilling. So obviously we have to be accommodating of people, and we have to be able to see the positive in other people. But when we look in the mirror, that's not a time to start being all accommodating. When we look in the mirror, we have to be able to say, you know what, Hashem has designed me to have self-control. That's what it means to be human. That's the distinction between a human being and an animal. And so if there are things that I'm not supposed to do, then those are things that I'm not supposed to do. And if there are things that I am supposed to do, then those are things that I am supposed to do. And I don't really have any excuses not to do those things. Hasidim used to have an expression. I don't know if you've ever heard this expression before. Very interesting expression. They used to say like this: Was men tornit, tormenit. Was men meg, darf men it. What does that mean? Was men tornit, what we're not allowed, we're not allowed. That's it. It's very simple. If it's not allowed, it's not allowed. It's nothing to discuss. Was men meg, and what we are allowed, darf men it. We don't necessarily have to have. So that's how that was the saying that Hasidim had. Right? What you're not allowed, you're not allowed. It's non-negotiable. There's nothing to discuss. And what you are allowed, you don't necessarily have to have. So then Hasidim used to take that saying and they used to expand on it. And they used to say that if a person has not had the opportunity to learn Hasidus, if a person has not, for example, learned the Tanya, then very often what people say is, Vos men megmen ad sheteitze nishmascha. That if there's something which is permitted by the Torah, then basically that means that it's almost obligatory. So, for example, if there's food that is kosher, then in many people's minds, it's now a mitzvah to eat that food, because after all, it's kosher, right? So you got to eat, you got to indulge. On vos mentornit, and then people would often say, and that which you're not allowed, megmen oichabissel. Maybe you can just sneak in a little bit here and there, which, if you think about it, is often human nature, right? I know I'm not allowed to, but... Right? Ever hear people use that expression? I know I shouldn't do this, but. I know I shouldn't say this, but. So, Basman Tornet, that which we're not allowed, Megmenei Chapisel, can also have it a little bit. What Chassidus wants to teach us, and that's exactly what we're learning in this chapter, is Basman Tornet, Tormenit, Achateitze Nishmaschai. If there's something that the Torah forbids, that means that it is absolutely off the cards, even to the extent of literally putting one's life on the line. That's how serious it is when we say that something is not allowed. And really what the Torah wants us to learn, and what Hasidus teaches us, is think of it this way. Can you imagine somebody who says, listen, I know that something is poison, but I'm just going to have a little bit. We'd look at that person and say, you're Meshugana. It doesn't matter that it's just a little bit. It's poison. Poison is something that is to be avoided at all costs. So what Hasidus wants us to understand is that if there's something that the Torah says I'm not allowed, that means that it's poison. And then under no circumstances am I going to say, oh, sorry, I kind of wasn't paying attention. I was just a little bit impulsive at the time. No, you don't, like in the same way as you don't impulsively take a chainsaw and start, destroying your house. Or you don't impulsively say, well, I know that I shouldn't put my hand on the stove, but I don't know, I'm just finding it so tempting just to put my hand on the stove. So we don't have these kinds of experiences. And that's how every person is capable of avoiding becoming a rasha, because every person is able to illustrate to themselves that these are things which are poison for my neshama. And therefore I'm going to stay away from them with every fiber of my being, on the one hand. And on the other hand, these are things which are completely enriching, and so I'm going to do them even when I'm not in the mood of doing them, and even when I'm tired, and even when I don't feel like it. Like, for example, coming to the Tanya Shir, even when it's been a long day, and I don't necessarily have the capacity to be able to sit through the Tanya Shir, but I'm going to do it because I know that this is enriching for my neshama. So that's how every single person is able to be a rasha avoidant. Right? Every single person is able to escape a rasha, and any person who hasn't yet succeeded in doing so, well, it's very obvious that they obviously need to work harder. And then he concludes this particular section by telling us, Vein toiv ela Torah, dahaina talmud Torah shekeneged kulam. We said that there are two categories. The one category is sur meirah, staying away from things which are forbidden by the Torah. And the other category is asay toiv, doing things which the Torah requires. And we call that asay toiv. We call that doing good. Now, the word toiv, the word good, is synonymous in Judaism with the Torah itself. So the ultimate goodness is the Torah itself. And therefore, when we speak about the fact that a person is supposed to asay toiv, that you're supposed to proactively do good things, primarily more than anything else, that means that you're supposed to learn Torah. Now, that's probably one of our greatest challenges, is learning Torah. And when I say that it's one of our greatest challenges, I don't mean that it's hard for us to learn Torah. Of course we learn Torah. Everybody learns Torah at some point, to some extent. But do we learn Torah in the way that Judaism mandates that we learn Torah? That's the real trick. And what Judaism mandates is that we learn Torah at every free moment. Now, none of us are there. Ever since the advent of the smartphone, however good people might have once upon a time been at learning Torah in every free moment, we now have this mega challenge, because every free moment that we have, we're finding out some rubbish about what's going on in the world, or on somebody else's social media feed, or whatever the case is, rather than learning Torah. So if a person wants to avoid being a rasha, it's a really big challenge, because avoiding being a rasha means if you've got spare time, instead of doom scrolling through some kind of nonsense on social media, you should actually be learning Torah. So I think we still have a little bit of a way to go in this particular area. But the point that he's making, and if you want to summarize the message of this chapter, the message of the chapter is, don't worry, nobody's putting pressure on you to be a tzaddik. So if you don't have that level of passion to serve Hashem, and you're not deriving all of your joy and pleasure out of your Judaism, that's okay. As long as you're doing what Judaism requires, and as long as you're not breaking any rules, then you're fine. Because the deal was that if you're not going to reach the level of a tzaddik, at the very least, al tehi rasha, that you're not going to be a rasha, and you're good. However, there's still a niggling question, which I mentioned right at the beginning of this of tonight's shir, and we now have to unpack it. The niggling question is, you could have really made this a whole lot simpler. Before the neshama came into this world, you could have just said, swear that you will not be a rasha, and that's it. Because then it would have been really clear to us that there is no expectation to become a tzaddik, and we'd appreciate that the reason there's no such expectation is because it's really above our pay grades. And then we'd be satisfied by the fact that we just have to focus on one objective, and that is, don't be a rasha. And we'd understand that that means two things. Do the things that Judaism expects, and avoid the things that are illegal in Judaism, and that's it. So the question is, why was the beginning of that oath tehi tzaddik, to be a tzaddik? It feels like such a terrible tease. Here you are, telling me, chase a goal that you cannot achieve. Well, then why make that a goal in the first place? So it's that part of the conversation that we have to now revisit, and that we have to now explore again in detail. Why are we saying over here, tehi tzaddik, that there is a goal to be a tzaddik? And from here until the end of the chapter, He's basically going to tell us, well, the reason is because maybe you can't be a tzaddik 24/7. In other words, it can't become the level that you attain spiritually, but that doesn't mean that you can't taste the tzaddik experience at certain times. And that's going to actually be the first part of the deal. To hit tzaddik means at least some of the time experience what it is to be a tzaddik. At least some of the time taste the tzaddik life. Now that sounds very nice in theory, but how on earth are you going to do that? Because bearing in mind that what is the definition of a tzaddik? Not just somebody who behaves the way that the Torah expects, not just somebody who avoids anything which the Torah forbids, because you could do that and just simply be a Beinoni. What does it mean to be a tzaddik? We've identified it. Tzaddik is somebody who has this very deep, profound passion for Hashem. That's what they care about. That's what they live for. That's where their joy comes from. That's where their pleasure comes from. How am I supposed to get there? At times, either it's within range or it's not within range. So how on earth can we propose this idea of tasting the tzaddik life from time to time? That's what we're going to focus on in the last part of the chapter. Okay, afal pichen. So if you're having a look inside the book, it's on page 62, and it is just over halfway down that second paragraph. Remember, page 62 is split into two paragraphs. So it's just over halfway down the second paragraph. You'll see that there's a little full stop. It's the second word on the line, followed by an acronym. Af al pichen. That's what the acronym stands for. Af al pichen. Even though we have made it absolutely clear that we are not going to become a tzaddik, that the tzaddik is light years ahead of our spiritual capacity. So in spite of all of that, af al pichen, tzorich likboya lo itim. Part of how we develop ourselves and how we grow spiritually is we have to have something called kavius itim. Kavius itim means when you set certain times on your calendar. Now, any person who's a somewhat disciplined person will have allocated times on the calendars for all kinds of things. You'll have time on your calendar to go to the gym. You'll have time on your calendar to have downtime. You'll have time to strategize, to meet clients, to speak to your executive team, or whatever it is. Any person who has a little bit of discipline in their life will have kvios itim. They'll have certain times that they've allocated for certain roles and certain responsibilities. So over here we're saying tzorich likboya lo itim gamkein. A person also, in addition to all of the generic stuff that we're doing in terms of our Judaism, we also have to set fixed times in our schedule. And what are we supposed to do during those times? To strategize. So in the same way as a person might strategize around their business, or they might strategize around their personal health. So you have to have times to strategize around your spiritual growth. That's part of what it is to be a Jewish person. We've got to have times that we strategize our personal growth, which means, it's going to be very specific over here. Liyois moyais bera. So you've got to have time on the calendar. And this is a fascinating thought. So you've got to imagine somebody opens up your Outlook. And what do they see over there? They see allocated Thursday morning, 9 a.m., despise bad. Because that's what he says. Moy'eis bera. You have to have certain times where you actually go through that experience of despising bad. Remember, we said, what is the hallmark of a tzaddik? That the tzaddik derives pleasure from godliness. And therefore, the flip side of it is that they are disgusted by things which are misaligned with godliness. If I want to taste the tzaddik experience, then basically what that means is sometimes I actually do have to feel disgusted by things that are against the Torah. So again, generally speaking, the average person walking through a shopping mall and they go past the Treif restaurant and there's all the aromas that are wafting out of the Treif restaurant, the average person is going to say, wow, that smells delicious. But I'm going to have self-control and I'm not going to now decide that I'm not keeping kosher anymore. So it's just unfortunate that it smells so good. Here we're saying that every once in a while we've got to do the exercise of saying, oh, that is disgusting. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to have a time on your schedule where you go sit outside a non-kosher restaurant and, take in all the smells and then say, but it's disgusting. That's not what we're suggesting. We're suggesting over here a mental exercise. And this is built on the foundation that the human mental ability is very powerful. And when a person does have, as they call, mind over matter, Moyach shalit al alev, when a person employs their brain, you can do some really, really powerful things. And we know this from other areas of life, not only from within Judaism, that when a person applies their mind to something, that can make things really real for themselves. So when we talk about scheduling these times to be able to feel disgusted by negativity, what we really mean is that a person has to schedule certain times where I rethink how I experience and how I see the world. Now, the next line that he's going to say is a line that is absolutely 100% guaranteed to insult all the women in the group. But that's not the intention of this line. I've done this enough times to know what happens next. So everybody's like, what? How could you talk like this? And so on and so forth. So it's really important that we contextualize properly what he's saying. So Kogoin Batzas Chachmeinu Zal, he's going to quote a quotation from the Gemara, where the Gemara says, well, what should a person do if they are in fact attracted to beautiful women? And that's not appropriate, right? As we've already discussed, that a person is not supposed to veer after their heart and after their eyes. And that, for example, the Rambam writes in Hilchos Teshuvah, in the laws of Teshuvah, he says that people often excuse themselves and say, but I didn't touch anybody, I didn't have an illicit relationship, I just looked. What's so bad about looking? And he says very clearly, that's why the Torah tells us, lo yisasuru, that you're not supposed to focus, not supposed to go after your eyes. Now, it's really difficult for a person to have that level of self-control. A person's walking in the street, especially in the modern world, where people walk around in a way that's very often quite exposed, and people are often very in your face, not only in terms of how they dress, but also in terms of how they carry themselves. And people are flirtatious. So how does a person rein themselves in? So the Gemara has a piece of advice. And this piece of advice, like I said, guaranteed to insult a whole group of people. What does the Gemara say? That you should meditate on the following. Isha chemes melei, that you should meditate on the fact that this attractive woman, who the person is finding to be such a big challenge in their life, oh my gosh, how do I not look? And it's inappropriate, whatever. So what you're supposed to think is redefine what you're looking at. Isha chemes melei. Just consider that basically what you're looking at is a physical container of excrement. That's basically how you should look at it. So this is not something, obviously, that you say to your wife, right? What's the message, though? The message is a very profound message, because basically what it's saying is, at the end of the day, we've just come from Purim, and Purim is all about masks and about how things are not the way that they appear. So one of the most important things to know if we want to grow ourselves spiritually is that things are not the way that they appear. And very often what attracts us to something is the external physical appearance of something. And that's definitely not a healthy way to invest or to connect with something or someone. So for example, if you want to just step out of the Tanya for a moment, we know that one of the things that society does, which it should not do, is objectifying women. So rather than looking at a woman as a human being who has emotional maturity and intellectual value and whatever accolades the person may have achieved in their lifetime, there's a big segment of society who makes it purely about what she looks like physically. So her physical appearance becomes the rate of the value of that woman in society. Now, that is obviously an incredibly superficial way to look at the world. Now, when is a person going to feel an inappropriate attraction to somebody? When they look at the world that way. So if all they're seeing in a person is their physical appearance, their physical beauty, then naturally the kind of attraction that they're going to have to that person is going to be altogether inappropriate. So the Chazal, the sages in the Gemara tell us, there's immediately a way to shift that, and that's to say, okay, so if all I care about this person is their physical appearance, then I need to put on my X-ray glasses, and when I put on my X-ray glasses, I'm going to see the internal anatomy of a human being. The internal anatomy of a human being is far from attractive. Theoretically, if people did not have skin, nobody would be attracted to anybody. Because at the end of the day, what would you see? Muscles and organs and skeleton. It's not particularly attractive. So that's what the Gemara is saying. If you want to make that correction and not only not feel attracted to somebody because of their superficial appearance, but to actually find yourself a little disgusted at yourself for summarizing somebody purely as their physical appearance, well, one of the ways to do this is to remind you what's going on inside. There's all this pollution inside the human body that eventually builds up and has to be gotten rid of. So if you're looking at the physical, that's actually what the physical looks like. And to perhaps give it another layer, if I was looking from the perspective, let's say, of an angel, that's actually how angels see us. Angels see us just as these machines that are constantly taking in energy and then disposing of waste. That's basically how they look at us. And when you look at a person that way, then you recognize that the physical attraction is not what should make me feel in any way drawn to that person. And I need to find something that's a little bit more elaborate and a little bit more meaningful than just the physical anatomy, because the physical anatomy, quite honestly, is not truly attractive on the inside. So when he says that a person is supposed to have these tzaddik moments, that means literally to schedule into my diary certain times where I rethink how I look at all of those things that I find to be so physically compelling. Okay, just look at it a little differently. It's not as as glorious as it appears on the outside. Another way to look at it, let's say that a person, for example, is very attracted to have a physical pleasure. Let's say that physical pleasure is a great piece of steak. Now, that's a normal and natural thing, that people are going to want to have a piece of steak, right? And I'm not a tzaddik, so if I'm not a tzaddik, then it's not like I'm sinning because I want to have a piece of kosher steak. It just means I'm a materialistic person. But there's nothing fundamentally against God by wanting to have a piece of steak. Yes, of course, I'm prioritizing materialism over the spiritual, and that's not going to help me grow myself spiritually. But if I was a tzaddik, I'd look at that piece of steak and say, come on, that's what excites you, that's what attracts you. And it would actually make the person feel queasy and uneasy and nauseous and say, I'd much rather be spending this time invested in something spiritual. So I can do the exercise myself as well and say, think of the very favorite food, my best food in the whole world. How long does it remain a pleasure? And what happens to it after it's a pleasure? Well, basically, it also becomes the waste matter that my body's going to have to get rid of. So that gives me context. And that's effectively what he's saying. Part of the reason that before we are born, we're told to take this oath, to heat tzaddik, that you will be a tzaddik, means that part of what we're supposed to be doing on a regular basis is think tzaddik-like, which is look at the world beyond what meets the eye. Don't just give something a value because of the pleasure in the now. Don't just give something a value because of the appearance that is so attractive. Let yourself see what things really are in their ultimate physical state, which is always going to be a degraded state. And that will help you to feel a little bit offish, say, I don't necessarily want to invest my whole life and energy in chasing that stuff. And so he concludes this section by telling us, any pleasure that this world has to offer, any person who has a little bit of foresight, which is what we call a wise person, if a wise person is somebody who has foresight, is able to see that everything, it will eventually rot, everything will eventually decompose, and so there's no real value in chasing the stuff of this world because it doesn't have lasting value. And we should do this exercise on a regular basis because it will help us keep a sense of context and perspective, and that will help us to grow ourselves spiritually. And while we will not become a tzaddik, at least we'll have some of the benefit of some of the insight that a tzaddik has. Like I say, we still have more to do about this concept of having tzaddik moments from here till the end of the chapter, which please God will continue next time.